Hi, and welcome to the Long Range Shooting and Custom Rifle Building podcast presented by Wolf Precision Incorporated, where we learn about and share long range shooting and custom rifle building. I am your host, Jamie Dotson, and welcome to the show. Hi, and welcome to episode 184 of Wolf Precision's Long Range Shooting and Custom Rifle Building podcast. I'm your host, Jamie Dotson, and welcome back to the show. In this episode, we're going to be talking about bedding, some misconceptions and some truths, some things you need to think about, and why you may or may not choose to have it done to your rifle. So this ought to be a great podcast. So without further ado, here we go. All right, before we get started, I do want to say a quick thank you to TriggerTech. TriggerTech is the maker of fine rifle triggers. We recommend them to be put in all of our rifle kits here, and we believe that they're some of the safest, easy to install, easy to adjust triggers on the market. They make them for lots of different makes and models. So if you want to upgrade your rifle or your shooting game a little bit, you can do it by putting a high quality, safe trigger in your rifle. And you can stop over to triggertech.com. That's triggertech.com and see all they have to offer today. We'd also like to thank MDT. MDT is the maker of fine rifle chassis. They are incredibly solid, incredibly diverse from all the different options that they offer to all the different models, from the JAE 700 to the Oryx chassis, which we think is one of the most unsung heroes that you'll find out there as far as a sub $500 chassis that we think should be a $1,000 chassis. So they have a lot of great makes and models. And we always say if you want to shoot to 1,000 yards and do it well and consistently, the stock has to fit you perfectly. So finding a stock that fits you and your specific shooting positions, as well as your specific form and format and body, you can stop over and check out all the great options MDT has to offer today. So you can stop over to mdttac.com. That's mdttac.com. So we're going to dive into bedding here a little bit, and we're going to come back and circle around to the movers that we have coming up in March. And I want to talk a little bit about why movers would be so important to consider taking as far as a class. But we have a new team member, Adam, who has joined us here for a little over a month. He has 20 plus years in the Marines. He was an instructor as well as a great marksman, and we're excited to have him on as our new team member here. And we're going through and teaching them all the different things that we do to rifles. And bedding has been one that we've been working on for a couple of weeks. Every time we get the opportunity, we're showing him how and starting to turn him loose on bedding rifles. So through our conversations of looking to bed the rifles themselves and trying to talk with them about all the importance, going back to the history, and I think this is where this podcast came into play, was just talking about, I think, the misconceptions that people have. So we were talking about bedding. And, why or why not? What does it really do? How does it really affect the gun? Where did it come from? And I think where bedding started and how people perceive it now are linked, and they couldn't be anything further from what they actually do to the rifle. So when talking to Adam about the history of bedding and why it was done in the early years compared to why we do it now, it's totally two separate reasons. And then to double down on that is the importance of the tang, or why bedding that tang is such a critical part. So most people think recoil lug, front of the receiver, that's the A game, right? And it is important to have good support underneath the front of the receiver and at the recoil lug, right? But the most furthest point from the muzzle, and the one that can have the biggest impact for repeatable accuracy or holding that rifle in place, is the tang. It is the steering wheel of the barreled action, and it has a great deal to do with getting the ultimate accuracy out of it. And I think most people, when they bed rifles, professional or otherwise, they don't pay that much attention, and they let this area slip, or they don't build it up like we do. So if you ever look at any of our bedding jobs when we do a tang area, you'll see that we build it out and we add material, and we're going to dive into a whole rabbit hole of chassis issues here with this as well. So where to start? I would say let's start with the history of bedding and why we originally started bedding and why that really doesn't apply at all today. So 20 years ago, used to bed a lot of rifles. It wasn't uncommon for someone to bring in something like a Weatherby and say that, hey, I got this Weatherby, beautiful stock, hand engraved, all this stuff, no aluminum pillars, and a soft material underneath the receiver. Originally, bedding was almost like putting a full-length pillar underneath the receiver. So in my mind, bedding started from trying to put a harder material or a more supportive material underneath the actual action to keep that softer material from compressing, deforming, getting wet, all of these things that happen in that area that as you're taking your barreled action in and out or tightening and untightening your action screws, you've got a soft material underneath there that's not making great contact and can compress over time, leading to all kinds of issues. You go out and start shooting it. This isn't a very hard material, although it's solid. Heavy recoiling rifles can start to move around. They can shift a little bit, and these things can be detrimental to accuracy. So when you talk about bedding, 20, 30, 40 years ago, people weren't bedding it like we are today for the reasons we are today. They were bedding it because we didn't have aluminum pillars in wooden stocks back then. Now, we would install them, and you could, but you could also use a very hard material, something like Devcon steel putty or some of the earlier products that would create this hardened shell that mirrored the receiver that supported it the full length and kept it from compressing the softer material below. So it gave the action something to ride on that was very similar to aluminum pillar as far as what it did and its main job besides supporting the receiver and giving it good contact points. But bedding back then in my mind was more about giving it a harder material, something like we would see in a modern, like you think of a Macmillan, we order all of our Macmillans with an aluminum pillar in them. And the pillar isn't there for any other reason than to stop compression. We don't want the softer material that's the fill material to be able to compress or move around if people are using different torques or if they don't have a torque wrench that's exact or they're guessing or they're just tightening it in the field and over-tighten it. So those pillars are meant to support the receiver and keep that area from compressing. Bigger problem 20, 30 years ago with wooden stocks. Now, did it make a difference? Oh, my word, did it make a difference. You would be stunned on how accuracy changed, or in my mind, you allowed the rifle finally to shoot to its full potential. You took out some of the little gremlins that happened when they just put that barreled action into a wooden stock. And then, if you think about hunting back, when I was a kid, hunting in the snow, hunting in the rain, you've got hopefully a sealed stock, but if any water or moisture gets in there, there's all kinds of issues that can happen with the material that is built out of, and getting something underneath there that not only gives a solid material for the receiver to set on, but protects the softer material underneath, at least from the top side, sort of important. Now let's get into modern rifles and why bedding is done. When we start talking about modern CNC machining and we're talking about, let's just say, making a chassis, well, we can now make rifle stocks or chassis out of much harder materials, much more durable materials, and in an economical way than what we could 20, 30, 40 years ago. You could make an aluminum chassis 40 years ago. It would just have to be made, and very specifically, it would be very expensive to do, the time that it would take to do it properly. There's just a lot to it. Modern CNC has allowed us to use different materials than what we would use, 20, 30 years ago, and that's because it's not as expensive as it used to be. Now, they're still expensive, and I don't want to throw it out there that it's cheap. But that said, the reason we used wooden stocks forever was because it was a couple of dollars, right? It was really inexpensive to have the duplicator spitting out these wooden stocks all day long. Now we can use a harder material. The problem that we run into with chassis, and this is why we bed them, is modern machining. So we have custom receivers all over the place. Most are Remington type clones, which measure 1.350 for their round. But the problem occurs when you try to fit that receiver into an inletted stock that's inletted 1.350 round, right? So there's several issues that come into play and why bedding a chassis is so important. And there are ways that the manufacturers have tried to deal with this. And in a way, it's sort of a shorthand and not what I would consider ideal at all. So if we take two circles and we have them exactly the same size, the 1.350 on the first circle, that is a full round circle, and then consider like a half a circle that we're going to set that down inside of, and that's 1.350. When we set the first circle inside the other circle, if they are exactly the same, they will touch and mirror perfectly, right? The problem is that they cannot do that with modern manufacturing. Your receiver can be 1.349 and the stock be 1.351. If the action is undersized, in other words, if you have two round surfaces or, the receiver's round and then you have the moon cut out or the round cut into the chassis to mirror that, if the receiver is smaller, let's just say 1.349, then the inlet on the stock or the chassis, and let's just say that was 1.351, the receiver will only ride on the bottom. In other words, it won't touch the sides. It can only have one contact point. If the receiver is bigger than the chassis, let's just say the receiver is 1.351 and the chassis is inlet and it's 1.350, the action will only touch on 2 points on the side. In other words, it's bigger, so as it's dropping down in that second circle, it's going to hit the sides first. This is the dilemma in making chassis now. The other issues that can happen, and let me just throw them out there. You can have small tapers machined into the receivers. If the receiver is ever so slightly held off or something happens, it could start at 1.350 and maybe end at 1.3495, over 6 or 7 inches. You can have tapers cut into them. Another really big issue, and this was a big issue for Remingtons forever, is that they're usually heat treated after they're machined, so they have a tendency to warp. And if they warp at all, and you take that receiver, you roll around receiver on the table, like take an old Remington 700, take the recoil lug off, take the pick rails off, all that, and just roll it across the flat surface and watch. It's not straight. It's bent. It's bowed. It's from the heat treat. And so now we've got 2 contact points in the front and back, but nothing in the middle because the receiver's bowed in one direction or the other. Or even worse, what if it's bowed a little left and right? Now it's trying to hold the receiver cattywampus. So that introduces a whole nother level of complexity when you're trying to say, okay, we're going to drop fit this barreled action into a stock. Now, you'll hear us talk about on a previous podcast of why we sell the kits, and we will sell a kit to you with your stock. Let's just say you buy a great MDT chassis and you want to send it. This is your stock, right? You already have it. There's no sense of buying another one. We will mandate that you send that stock to us for us to fit it before we finish the build. We know that this is such an issue that if you truly want an incredibly shooting gun, this has to be either identified that it is or isn't a problem, and if it is a problem, it has to be fixed. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And I don't want to throw any bad vibes towards any manufacturer that's making chassis today because there's a lot of great chassis to choose from. But that said, one of the things I do not like is they always advertise the chassis as A, it will improve your accuracy, and B, it's drop fit, no gunsmithing required, just lock it in. That's not true. It can be, but it's not always true. And what they've done to eliminate some of the contact issues, and this leads us down the rabbit hole of another problem, is they've made rails or high spots about halfway up the inside of the chassis where it's inletted for your receiver to set in. There's usually 2 high spots, look like railroad tracks on both sides. And so as you're dropping your receiver down in, it's going to ride on those high spots, making contact on left and right of the receiver and giving it a good solid support, hopefully for the full longitudinal surface of the receiver. If the receiver's straight, my problem with it is now you've taken a surface area of the entire bottom of the receiver and you reduce the contact surface to the stock or the chassis itself from 100% to 5 or 7%. So when you drop that in and lock it in, you only have, of the whole surface area of the bottom of that receiver, maybe 7% touching the chassis. The rest is free floating. There's nothing supporting it. The other issue that I have when they do that technique, and they're trying to solve a problem. So I always say that anything you do to try to correct one problem, that's the yin, you have to look for the yang. There's always something else going to happen. These things are all connected. And so when you change one part of the process, you have to look downstream as to what else is going to happen. What is that going to affect positively or negatively? And one of the big deals is, what if I told you that when you do that, and you have, let's just say, a bad action, an igniter, and it's not bedded, and you're riding on those rails, what we consider like railroad tracks. And you can see a version of this. So I'm going to pause right here a second and send you over to our YouTube channel. Or if you want, go look at our latest blog that we put up on our website, because we actually wrote a small article on this, and I linked a video that we shot of a chassis that we bedded to show you the contact points and how little there is. Now, technically speaking, is it enough? Sure, it is enough. Is it enough for the perfect rifle? I don't think it is. Here's one of the other things. Guys always over-tighten their action screws. They think tighter's better, right? But do you know that when you have these rail-type contact surfaces on the side of the receiver, you have nothing supporting it underneath? If you over-tighten your action screws, you can pull your receiver out of round, almost into an oval a little bit, right? You're deforming it. And for me, that was like, wow, it is just a steel tube. And your screws have a lot of pulling force. And you overcrank on that, you can deform your receiver. And some people just have a tendency to over-tighten everything. But even at 65 inch-pounds, there's always that slight chance. Me and Bruce were talking about this quite often with bedding, and that was one of his concerns, that this can happen. And you can literally damage your receiver in the process to guarantee it when you put it in the next chassis, it might not fit right at all. So let's talk about the front of the receiver first. When we bed modern rifles, now we're going to go away from the reason why we bedded the old rifles. We're going to talk about why we bed modern rifles. We are basically filling in all the voids and giving it good contact across the whole mating surface where the front action screw is at, right? So we're filling in the void underneath where it's not supported at all. We're filling in the voids above the rails on the left and right side. And then we're giving it a lot more contact underneath where the recoil lug is at and at the back of the recoil lug. So we're giving those two surfaces probably 10 times the contact surface that you would have if you just locked it in. 10 times. That's 1,000%. Now let's talk about what we do to the rear. And here's, I think, where most of the people really confuse bedding. When you look at a lot of your modern bolt action rifles, and so when I was talking to Adam, and we're teaching bedding here, and doing a stress-free bed job is a lot different than just throwing material in there and filling in a bunch of voids and making it look pretty. There really is a technique to this. But I was telling him, for me, the most important part of the bedding job isn't the front, it's the back. And he looked at me a little like, what? And so I showed him that on the back of the receivers, where they're contacting a lot of the new modern chassis, the contact point is high up on the sides, just like it was in the front. Remember, we're riding on those like proverbial railroad tracks, right? But in a lot of cases, it's actually forward of the action screw a little bit, and the rear tang. And so you have no support where that screw is at, and nothing underneath holding it. You've got literally two contact points the size of a broken piece of lead off a number 2 pencil. And that, to me, the rear tang, I think, is the most important part of the bed job. And I was explaining it to Adam. I'm going to try to explain it on a podcast like this. The rear tang, in my mind, is the most critical part. The reason I want really good contact is, number one, we don't have a lot of surface area back at the tang because this trigger sets forward of it, right? So we're already limited on how much contact we can get. But that tang is U-shaped for a reason. That tang is bedded so it locks the receiver in from being able to shift left or right, under recoil, under vibration, any of that. It can't move. It is, think of it like your lip knot. If you pull your bow to a full draw, right where you're holding that trigger, right? If you allow that to move and shift a little bit, it has a massive impact on your point of aim. We want to anchor that. That is the anchor point to keep that receiver from being able to shift left and right and keep it held straight and true. That U doesn't just support it. It pulls that receiver down into that channel, and it now traps the very end of the tang from being able to shift left and right. And think about that. When you shoot a rifle, the receiver flexes a little bit. Everything moves. I mean, there's a lot of flex and movement when you fire, especially heavier recoiling rifles. If you don't have really awesome contact underneath the back of that tang, you can have the tendency that as it flexes and moves, that it might ride a little bit differently. It might set differently. Even taking the rifle in and out of the chassis for regular maintenance and cleaning, and you tighten it back down into a different spec, it can do different things. For example, I have seen with my own two eyes putting a barreled action into a quote-unquote drop-fit chassis, tightening the rear action screw to 65 inch-pounds, and watching the firing pin fall. So what was happening, just like I'm talking about here, your contact point of your rear action screw is forward of the action screw itself, high up on the sides of the receiver just before the trigger. If you tighten the rear of the receiver too much, you can actually pull that tang down. And as you're pulling that tang down, you're disengaging the trigger from the firing pin. And if you do it enough, you can get it to drop. And that was at 65 inch-pounds. So for me, it just doubles down on the safety part of it as well, that you get somebody that didn't buy a good torque wrench and they just, finger tighten it, right? And then they finger tighten a little bit more. And then they're like, wow, this gun's not shooting the greatest. Maybe I just have to really tighten the action screws. Do you see where this goes? Now they've reduced the contact point on the actual firing pin. Drop the gun goes off. So for me, when I bet a rifle now, my goal is to get good support under the front of the receiver, of course. And, people will say that the recoil lug helps keep your rifle in line longitudinally, like keeps your rifle in line from being able to shift left and right. But your recoil lug's main job really is to keep the rifle from sliding any more to the rear. It does hold it straight, don't get me wrong, but it's not an anchor point left and right yet. It doesn't have that support. And right behind it, you do have a round receiver being held in place, but it's not the furthest point back on the receiver. And so could it still shift around in there? Possibly. But when you go the whole way back to the rear tang and that U shape, you bed that really good with a lot of material. So if you look at your traditional chassis, I'm going to go one step further with this. If you look at your traditional chassis and you look at the rear action screw, take your barreled action out. That little piece of metal in front of the rear action screw, you have the hole where the action screw goes through. Look from the top. It's like 20, 30 thousandths thick. There's no support there. It's just meant to be a hole, and everything else in front of it's just machined out to save weight. When we bed a chassis, we actually build that out because we know it's not going to interfere with the trigger. We actually not only bed the tang, but we actually move that contact surface with good bedding compound forward to give you more support in contact area in front of the action screw and behind. And so it's so thin up there that the only thing you can bed is just this little piece back at the tang, and that's not enough for us. So we actually fill in and really bulk up that material, and we leave it. So we'll clean it up and make it look nice, and we'll make sure the trigger clears, but we leave a massive amount of, we call it DevCon steel putty, actually in front of the action screw as much as we can get up there to help support and build that area up a little bit. So going from old school to new school, going from why we bedded old rifle stocks that were wooden to why we bed modern chassis, they're completely different. The reasons why are completely different. Their jobs really are completely different. In the old rifles, we were trying to give a solid support underneath the receiver, sort of like what an aluminum pillar is today. Now we've got modern chassis that are much more firm, much harder, work like giant pillars, but in order to get them to work properly with the chassis, we have to do all these different types of cuts. We reduce the amount of support underneath the rear of the receiver, and sometimes we put the support in the wrong area, which can be detrimental to you, the shooter, or just cause you issues. And here's the bottom line. If you want a quarter-minute gun, you should bed the rifle. And that's not from me. That's from Bruce at Bat Machine. Their actions hold more world records than I think all others combined. I mean, Bat dominates King of 2 Mile, King of 3 Mile. They dominate bench rest. And they will tell you this is coming from the people who say that, hey, we're building the straightest, truest actions in the world. They still should be bedded. If you really want to get the most out of that rifle, if you want it to shoot to its fullest ability, once it's built, all the machining work is done and that rifle is put together and ready to drop into a stock or chassis, if you want that, you should bed the rifle. And not just bed it, but bed it right. So I'm going to take a quick moment here and say thank you to Krieger Barrels. Krieger is the maker of fine-cut rifle barrels. They're a family-owned and operated business in Wisconsin. They are probably one of the best in the world at what they do, and they offer a new program called Krieger Direct. So Krieger Direct is designed so you can log in, buy your barrel, and have it in as little as 2 to 3 business days. So proud sponsor of the show, and we do want to thank them for all their support that they've done with us over the years. We have known them for decades. Great people, great business, great barrels. So you can log on and see all the options that they have. So it gives you an opportunity to grab a world-class barrel and get it in a shorter amount of time. So you can learn more at KriegerBarrels.com. That's KriegerBarrels.com today. So this podcast went a little bit over, and maybe I dove too much into the bushes talking about the bedding. We'll do a follow-up on next week's, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of the materials that we use when we bed, and then we're going to talk more about the movers. We have a movers class coming up in March, and we want to invite everybody that would like to attend. Prerequisites is you have to be through a school, understand minutes and mills, or maybe consider taking our online course to get tuned up and understand some of the basics you'll need in order to build and shoot fundamentally movers. You got to have this core foundation of the fundamentals of marksmanship and understanding, hold over and hold off and using your reticle, first focal planes, all that stuff. So it's one of my favorite classes. I really look forward to this class every year. It's great barbecue. Brunswick stew is pretty famous in that area, and if you've never eaten it in Georgia, everybody has their own little spin on it. It's really good stuff, sort of addictive. But if you'd like to join us, I'd like to talk a little bit about why I've always enjoyed movers so much and why it's such a hidden art. And once you learn it, you have it for life. It's not one of those mystical, magical things that's going to take you 10 years to figure it out. We have a pretty good system. In about 2 days, we're going to leave you going home with a whole new skill set or a whole new set of tools in your tool belt that's going to change your world forever. Now, I just want to touch base a little bit more on that next week as well. Just some updates here. We do have a new blog we just put out as well. We talked about the bedding, and we have our video linked in there. You can see that at wolfprecision.net. And of course, we have our online long-range shooting school, which we're really proud of. We're going to be posting up a new video Saturday morning with it. We're just finishing up with what we consider like our shooting tests and some tips and techniques, and then we're going to get into some advanced subjects with that. You can learn more about that at wolfprecision.net as well, or you can go over to Patreon, register, and then come back to our online long-range shooting school at Wolf Precision and attend the course. I believe right now we have over 18 hours of content for you to go through, and it really is our in-person class, so you can get all the core fundamentals from the shooting school, from the convenience and comfort of your own home. And then, of course, after you complete the online course, you can come in and join us for graduation day, which is a full day at the range going over all the things that we teach here with rifle in hand and sort of be able to put all of this newfound knowledge to the test. So we're looking forward to that for 2024 as well. So thank you, everybody, for taking the time to join us here at the show. We really appreciate it. We're looking forward to a banner year. Machines are up and running. New products in the work. We're really excited for the Armorers course. We're a couple more courses we're going to be putting out online to show and teach and share with you everything that we can. But for all those that have left a nice comment, we really appreciate it. It helps us be found. And if you wouldn't mind leaving a nice comment below, if you enjoyed the podcast, that'd be great. If you want to support the show, you can stop over to Patreon, look up Wolf Precision, and for $3 a month, you can support the show. We call it the Wolf Pack. Thank you, everybody that's done that as well. And of course, if you like the podcast, you like to share it with someone that you know, we really appreciate that. It helps us a lot with our ratings. So until next week, thank you, everybody. We really appreciate you taking the time to tune in and listen. My name is Jamie Dotson. I'm your host, and you are listening to Wolf Precision's Long Range Shooting and Custom Rifle Building Podcast.